Welcome to the Qasim Rashid Show, a civil rights lawyer here to expose all forms of injustice with a sprinkling of dad jokes in between. Here's your host, Qasim Rashid.
Good morning and peace be upon you this beautiful Sunday, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid, and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. If you're listening on Substack, be sure to hit subscribe. Grateful for your support so that we can continue to have this advocacy and these conversations with thought leaders nationally and internationally. I want to thank you all for your texts, your tweets, for tuning in. I'm grateful you all listen and grateful that you all share this show. We've got a great show lined up. I want to talk about two main things. One, I want to talk about what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon, because this should be front and center. And it's a shame that media is largely ignoring it and not giving it the due attention it should, because this affects us intimately here at home. I also want to talk to someone I deeply admire, Harvard and MIT humanist chaplain Greg Epstein. If you are a reader, you've definitely read his book from about 12, 13 years ago called Good Without God. And I remember first picking up that book thinking that this is probably a book by an atheist bashing religion, because that was kind of what was in vogue. You had tons of books coming out in the post 9/11 era about how evil religion is and how faith is ending. And I thought this might have been another one of those. But it's an extraordinarily thoughtful read and something that I'm glad I read. And it's enjoyable to see Greg continue to rise, because now he's got a second book coming out called Tech Agnostic. And it's a fascinating read about how technology has kind of become this new religion. And it is kind of breaking the barriers in a negative way of what morality is, of what privacy is, and how we need to have a unifying effort of people who of faith and people who may not believe in God to stand united for a sense of justice and humanity. It's a powerful read. I'm midway through it, in full disclosure, because I just got the book less than 48 hours ago. But we're going to have Greg on to talk about it, and he's somebody I highly recommend you reach out to yourself. Before bringing Greg on, I do want to talk about the one-year anniversary of 10/7 and 10/9, when the formal bombing began of Gaza. And I want to start with a question that I've not heard anyone ask in media or answer in media. And the question is really quite simply this: why is it that we never hear media report that in the year prior to October 7th, Hamas killed 240 Israeli civilians, including 47 children, kidnapped 800 more Israeli children, held 8,000 Israelis hostage, and built more than 12,000 homes on Israeli land? The answer to this question of why you never hear media talk about this is because Hamas did none of those things. Instead, the Israeli government did these things to Palestinians in the West Bank in the year prior to 10/7. Yeah, the Israeli government killed at least 240 Palestinian civilians, including 47 children in the West Bank. And the articles that were out is that this has been the deadliest year on record for Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. By the way, there is no Hamas in the West Bank. In the year prior to 10/7, the Israeli government kidnapped 800 Palestinian children. This is according to Bet Salim, an Israeli human rights watchdog organization. Separated these children from their parents, put them in indefinite detention without access to counsel. And Bet Salim reports that 60% of them suffered physical abuse and at least 20% suffered sexual abuse. The Israeli government in the year prior to 10/7 held 8,000 Palestinian civilians hostage in indefinite detention without trial, without charge, without conviction, without due process, without access to legal counsel. And in the year prior to 10/7, the Israeli government built 12,000 illegal homes on Palestinian land, kicked out the Palestinians and built their own homes. And that was just in the first half of 2023. In fact, on October 6th, 2023, the human rights group called Defense of Children International reported, this year, and I'm quoting them, this year has witnessed the highest number of attacks on Palestinian children by Israeli forces, either by killing, maiming, or arresting. In August, Human Rights Watch said in a report that 2022 was the deadliest year for Palestinian children in the West Bank in 15 years. This year is even worse, as 45 children were killed by the occupation forces in 2022, but already 47 have been killed in 2023, and the year is not over, said Ayed Abu Qatesh from Defense of Children International. The main reason, he continues, for the spike is the fact that the complete lack of accountability, as there hasn't been a single case of accountability in the occupation army for killing or maiming of a child. Currently, and again, according to Defense of Children International, currently Israeli forces hold 160 Palestinian children in jails, including 32 under the age of 15. And since 2000, Israeli forces have killed 2,287 Palestinian children. These are children we're talking about, end quote. And I repeat, this report was published on October 6th, 2023. Palestinian lawyer and analyst and activist Diana Boutou states, quote, Israeli logic is that nothing justifies October 7th, but genocide is justified because of October 7th, end quote. And as we review the circumstances leading up to October 7th and Israel's actions since October 7th, it becomes impossible to dispute Boutou's point. Imagine the narrative and the headlines of each of the above described atrocities described Hamas instead of the Israeli government. And so, going back to my opening question, ask yourself, why is the average American wholly unaware that, in fact, each of those atrocities prior to October 7th are true of the Israeli government? You know, on October 7th, 2023, here's what I wrote. And I stand by these words. I wrote, as a human rights lawyer, I will always stand for justice for Israel and justice for Palestine, where every Israeli civilian and child is safe, and every Palestinian civilian and child is safe. That is the only path forward. I stand by those words. What Hamas committed on October 7th was a war crime because they targeted civilians. I say that unhesitatingly and unequivocally. And over the last year, in addition to my writing and advocacy, I've spoken repeatedly at my city council to demand ceasefire and release of all hostages. I've raised and donated thousands for Palestinian relief for Humanity First and Med Global. I've provided pro bono legal aid to those in need, sponsored Palestinian film festivals, marched in pro-peace marches to call for an end to the arms trade, protested outside the DNC, and advocated on the boards of multiple nonprofit organizations to call for an end to the siege on Gaza. And the thing is, whatever human rights work I've done in this space, it is insignificant to the incomparable work being done by healthcare workers and journalists in Gaza who are dying by the hundreds, rather by the thousands, from targeted strikes from the Israeli government. Reporters Without Borders documents at least 130 journalists killed by Netanyahu's military, journalists who remain relentless in telling their story in a media blackout imposed by Netanyahu. The Palestinian Health Ministry documents at least 1,151 healthcare workers killed by Netanyahu's military. They're providing care in what they describe as hell on earth due to the indiscriminate bombing of hospitals. And now nearly 100 surgeons have returned from Gaza and reported their surgical procedures and their attempts to save the lives of children who are being sniped. So these children are not being shot by shrapnel or collateral damage. They are being sniped in the head and killed single shot. These are war crimes. That doesn't happen accidentally. A sniper does not accidentally sniper a child. It's always deliberate. And you have more than 100 doctors independently saying this is what we're witnessing. The Lancet, which is the world's most prestigious medical journal, conservatively estimates at least 186,000 Palestinian civilians killed as of June 2024, a number that has no doubt increased since. Meanwhile, Israeli war crimes continue and funded and enabled by atrocious U.S. government policy. The ICC and ICJ have already well-documented war crimes by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. Multiple media outlets and NGOs have reported on the Israeli military raping prisoners at secret torture sites, bombing UN schools and designated safe zones more than 200 times, and illegally blocking aid. And despite Hamas accepting multiple demands of ceasefire proposed by Israel, which included release of all hostages, Netanyahu has prevented a deal. In fact, the families of the hostages are now calling him Mr. Death. Think about that. The families of the Israeli hostages are calling Netanyahu Mr. Death. For example, on May 6th, Hamas said it accepted a ceasefire proposal that includes release of all hostages. Israel rejected it. Again, on June 11th, Hamas accepted the binding UN Security Council resolution on ceasefire and release of all hostages. This was Israel's resolution that they proposed. And then Israel rejected it after Hamas accepted it. Zateo News journalist Prem Thakur asked about ceasefire to US State Department spokesperson Matt Miller. And Matt Miller responds in the same sentence. He goes, the USA never wanted a diplomatic resolution with Hamas. He flat out said it. He goes, the US never wanted a diplomatic resolution with Hamas. And so then Prem Thakur said, well, what about ceasefire? And then in the same sentence, Matt Miller responds and says, well, we could have a deal if Hamas would just come to the table. So simultaneously, we never wanted a ceasefire with, we could have a ceasefire if Hamas would just come to the table. I mean, the hypocrisy of this statement is just mind-boggling. And it ignores the reality that diplomacy has released hundreds of hostages and war has killed more than it has secured. Now, I could go on and on about how Blinken knowingly lied to Congress even after its own State Department told him that Israel is blocking aid to Gaza. I could talk about the fact that 61% of Americans and 77% of Democrats want Biden to stop arming Netanyahu. I could talk about the fact how Americans want Harris to break from Biden and uphold justice as promised. But this is where we are right now. And the reality is that Americans, Israelis, hostage families, Palestinians, the global consensus are in agreement to stop arming Netanyahu and end the siege on Gaza, return all hostages, withdraw Israel from Palestinian territories, build Gaza back up again with international aid, and have a meaningful sovereign Palestine. This is not in dispute. The question is, why does Biden continue to defy the American people and the Leahy laws and keep arming Netanyahu? If Ronald Reagan could force Israel to stop bombing civilians with a single phone call, which is what he did in the 1980s, why is Joe Biden so afraid to stop arming Israel to commit war crimes? You know, I'll close with this and we'll go to break and bring on Greg Epstein. But I attended a fundraiser for Gaza with Med Global a few weeks back, and among the powerful display of witness testimonies from Gaza, we were reminded the names of Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old Palestinian girl that Israeli forces shot to death with more than 355 bullets from a tank. We were reminded of the 2 aid workers, Yusuf Zaino and Ahmed Al-Madoun, who the Red Crescent deployed to save Hind with the permission of the Israeli military, who then shot and killed Yusuf and Ahmed anyway. We were reminded of Rifat Al-Ghair, a Palestinian writer, poet, and professor and activist from the Gaza Strip that the Israeli military murdered with a targeted drone strike. And we were reminded, above all else, that these people are not statistics, they're human beings. And there's 186,000 similar such stories at minimum. If you've ever looked at history and looked at atrocities and asked yourself, what would I do had I been alive at that time? The answer is, it's whatever you're doing right now to stop the genocide in Gaza. That's it. It is imperative that we as Americans, and indeed all people globally committed to justice and humanity, exert our efforts to secure that permanent and lasting ceasefire and release of all hostages, and meaningful resources to rebuild Gaza and Palestine into a sovereign state, and meaningful accountability for those who've committed war crimes. If you have influence over your politicians, speak to them. If you have resources to donate to relief agencies, donate. And if all you have is your voice to speak up for justice, then by God, let your voice be heard. When we come back from break, we'll bring on Greg Epstein, somebody I deeply admire, the humanist chaplain at Harvard and MIT. He's got a phenomenal new book out that talks about many of these issues about the morality of tech and how we build a more cohesive, compassionate, and thoughtful world together as people of faith and no faith. It's a great read. I'm reading it right now. Highly recommend it. It comes out October 29th. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back with Greg Epstein after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. As promised, the godfather to the humanist movement, according to the New York Times Magazine, is here. Greg M. Epstein serves as a humanist chaplain at Harvard University and at MIT. He has a whole long list of amazing accolades, including one of my favorite books, Good Without God, which might sound interesting for people listening because I'm an observant Muslim. Why would I appreciate a book called Good Without God? I think Greg writes a really important piece at a really critical time in the conversation. We'll talk about that. But I'm glad to have him here to talk about his new book that I am about halfway through called Tech Agnostic. And we'll dive into that. But it's a phenomenal thesis, how technology became the world's most powerful religion and why it desperately needs reformation. Greg and I are also sacred voter fellows for Interfaith America. That's how we connected, and I'm grateful to have him with us today. Greg, thank you for being with us.
Qasim, thank you so much for having me on your show. This is fantastic to talk to you. You're one of the people I most admire in the space of religion across the world, honestly.
Thank you. No, I mean, the feeling is mutual, and I think the reason why the feeling is mutual is because I see you as just a really thoughtful person who can take these really important issues and just grapple with them to find ways to build bridges rather than attack and tear down. And you disagree respectfully and honestly and transparently, and then you also find ways to recognize the humanity in all of us. And that's why I'm grateful to share this platform with you, and we'll definitely have you on in the future. I want to kind of just dive into your book, Tech Agnostic, because this is the reason why this kind of piqued my interest so much is because you really wrote about something that's been bugging me for a long time. And really, technology kind of has become a religion in some respects. But rather than me talk about defining that, I'd love to hear the origin story from you. What inspired this book? Why is this book needed right now? And what are you hoping to accomplish with this book?
Thank you so much. So it starts with the fact that I've been a chaplain for and to the non-religious for over 20 years, both at Harvard, where I first arrived to do that work in 2004. And then at MIT, where I started in 2018 doing both Harvard and MIT, which are sort of down the block from one another. And yeah, so I got to Harvard at this very interesting time where there were very few people who held the title humanist chaplain anywhere in the world, certainly anywhere in North America. And I really believed that there was a rising generation of people who were going to stop affiliating religiously the way that the people had been in the past. And I guess that turned out to be a decent guess. The numbers now suggest, we're around 30%, 25%, whatever, of the American population. And, maybe 1 billion people in the world was the argument that I made in the first book, Good Without God, who call themselves non-religious. And so, that was something that, that was my life. But in 2018, I began to, I had been working on a non-religious congregation for the past decade or so, thinking like the non-religious people need to do something that's similar to what religious people do. And so we worked really hard on that, raised millions of dollars, spent millions of dollars, got thousands of people involved. It was really interesting. But I got this sense around the birth of my son, maybe in 2016, that like this wasn't quite the thing that was going to change the world or help change the world in the way that I was hoping to do. And so was trying to figure out what I am going to do with my life at that point. And at that point, I was invited to MIT to also be a chaplain there. And I had been, I'd been asked to consider something like that a few years before. And I figured like, no, I'm already at Harvard. I'm pretty busy. Why bother? But the T in MIT really fascinated me in 2018 because I realized we had been living through this profound profound transformation in the years since I've been there. The first year that I got to Harvard, somebody asked me if I'd seen some ad that was on the Facebook, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And in 2018, it had become like a second skin, social media, the internet, etc. Right?
Yeah.
And so I had been trying with my non-religious congregation essentially to connect the world and bring the world closer together in a secular way. And other than the secular way, I stole that phrasing from Mark Zuckerberg, because that is what his aspiration for Facebook and Meta was, and I guess still is. With the AI revolution, nobody can tell anymore what anybody is trying to do. Build God, I guess. But I realized that's what the social media tech world has been trying to do, and they did it more successfully, not necessarily ethically, not necessarily for the human good, but they did it more successfully than one could ever possibly imagine. And I realized, wait a second, that's not the only thing about Zuckerberg and his world and the other big tech titans work that reminds me of religion. I started thinking, like, they've got a lot of ideas that sort of remind me of theology and almost a doctrine. They've got rituals. I mean, people pray once a week, twice a week, 5 times a day, whatever. We genuflect before our stained glass black mirrors hundreds of times a day. And we look like we're worshiping when we do. And unlike certain religions that I could mention, this one seemed to have a non-zero chance of causing an actual apocalypse. And so, the thought was, wait, what is tech now? Because it's not an industry anymore, right? I mean, what industry in the world isn't a tech industry at this point? So what is it? And I realized that maybe religion is a really good frame to help us understand what tech has become in our lives.
There's the irony of that really witty comment you made is so many of our movies are built around the idea of tech getting out of control and launching war. The Terminator movies and the Matrix movies, and I mean, you can go on and on. Aeon Flux. I mean, there's so many films and adaptations out there under this concept. And so I think you absolutely address this, because really, when we look at the impact that tech has had over the last 25 years-ish or so, it's had certainly the ability to influence some massive movements for good, right? The Arab Spring is attributed to the access that folks had to Twitter, to technology, to organize and to activate and to overthrow dictators. And I think most people would argue that's probably a good thing. Likewise, you mentioned Zuckerberg. Facebook has been credibly accused, and I think it's pretty clear at this point that they helped enable the Rohingya genocide by allowing extremists in Myanmar to perpetuate, horrific and false information about the Rohingya Muslims, enabling that genocide, which people forget is still ongoing in many respects. China is using tech to target aggressively Uyghur Muslims and enable a genocide there as well. And so the idea of there being some kind of protocol makes sense. And it's a perfect segue to page 215 of your book, where you write, and I'm quoting here, and I think this is a very thoughtful quote. You say, in order to reform the religion of technology, we need a movement of gutsy skeptics who refuse to be charmed or purchased by big tech. We need people who will not simply go along with bad ideas, worship false gospels, or swallow the propaganda put out by gilded empires from antiquity to Amazon. In the tech religion, thankfully, apostasy and heresy are not rare. This is an enormous and growing pushback against big tech's claims, and now big AI as well, from scholars and journalists to activists, artists, and everyday people who start out simply trying to live until they are provoked by unjust and inhumane systems. It's a lot of words. Let's talk about that. We need a movement of gutsy skeptics. What does that look like, and who's leading this movement?
Thank you, Qasim. It's really moving to hear you read that. And in some cases, it's religious people who are leading the movement. In many, probably most cases, it's women and people of color, or both. It is the people who have been harmed by this new religion, who have been in the undercastes, or the at the bottom of the hierarchies of this very dogmatic new religion, which, as Ijeoma Oluo, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of So You Want to Talk About Race, tells me in a really powerful set of conversations that I have with her in the book. She says, look, the thing about this new religion, which she kind of agreed with me, is that it really does have power for people. It creates a kind of utopia for white
Yeah.
men.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the people who have lived the other side of this, um, who are are recognizing that we need skepticism. We desperately need critical thinking, because what we're being asked to do with technology, it's not that all technology is bad. I would never say that. I can't imagine anybody ever would. But it's that we're being asked to have this uncritical, you could use blind, I would say maybe that's an ableist term, but you could say blind faith that everything about this technology is going to save us. It's going to be a kind of messianic entity in our world. You've got Elon Musk saying just yesterday, I believe, this will be the biggest product ever of any kind. You've got somebody like a Mark Andreessen, the billionaire, multi-billionaire venture capitalist, investor, founder, et cetera, who writes, we believe any deceleration of AI will cost lives. He says
Wow.
deaths that were preventable by the AI that was prevented from existing is a form of murder. Okay. So
Wow.
he's actually using the exact logic of anti-abortion fundamentalists and
Yeah.
other religious fundamentalists to say, if you don't pump billions and billions, actually, the AI people are now looking for trillions and trillions of dollars, and they're on their way to getting it. If you don't pump trillions of dollars into our machine and directly into our wallets, not only is that bad, but you're actually mass murderers if you don't go along with what we're asking for.
Yeah, I mean I think that's why this book is so important. And I neglected to mention this. We're just tuning in. We're speaking with Greg Epstein, Harvard and MIT humanist chaplain, at Harvard and MIT, not of Harvard and MIT, as I learned. And if the lawyers are out there, know what the difference is, and the rest of you, it doesn't matter. It's just lawyers are being annoying. But remind us, Greg, when does this book officially hit the bookshelves, or is it's out now?
No, it's not out yet. It comes out on October 29th.
Okay, so good.
And it was kind of, we thought about, do you put a book like this out during the peak of the election season? But ultimately we decided to do that because of the sorts of things that both you and I are involved in, Qasim. It's the idea that you can no longer have a conversation about how democracy works
Yeah.
without talking about the role that tech is playing in our lives, and so and religion as well, right? Like, you and I are in this fellowship, the Vote is Sacred Fellowship, which is sponsored by Interfaith America, the biggest interfaith organization in the United States, if not the world. And it's religious leaders across a very diverse spectrum, and myself as a humanist leader, of course, coming together to talk about the fate of democracy, strengthening democracy, protecting democracy so that it can survive, first of all, right?
Yeah.
And religion has a huge role to play in that, because it represents communities of countless millions of people. But interestingly, like, when I was coming up as a student of religion, maybe 20, 25 years ago, I was trained to think that you couldn't do more, you couldn't do better in politics when you wanted to bring together power than to get all the different religious communities together, because they
Sure.
were the center, the locus of power. But that's no longer exactly true, Qasim.
Yeah.
Now when I talk to my fellow chaplains, 50 fellow chaplains at Harvard, 30 something at MIT, what I say to them is, this thing is bigger than what you do. It's bigger than what I do. It's bigger than what all of us do combined. Tech is having more of an impact on our world today than any religion in the world, easily.
Let me sit on that for a minute. It's having a bigger impact than any religion in the world today. I think part of that, we need to define what impact means.
Oh, I don't mean positive impact.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. Like, I mean, just impact in general, what that means. Because I don't want to use the phrase devil's advocate. I just want to think this out loud.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's maybe easily I was being a little too hyperbolic. But
I guess my point is, there's no doubt the impact is massive and outsized, and I think more than, we're both in our 40s. I think it's more than we probably could have anticipated when we were in our teens in the 90s, and kind of see what it is now. And I often think about this as, it's ultimately still a tool. It's still a vehicle for existence. There's nothing innate.
That's what it should be. Yeah. And I have no problem with the use of tech as a tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then the question really for me comes in, and maybe this is not directly related to your comment, because I think your comment is profound and has deep value, is who gets to decide what is the moral or ethical way to use technology?
Yeah, exactly.
And I can tell you from my Islamic tradition that, for example, on privacy, there's a really deep philosophy and moral teaching on privacy. And I wrote a piece for this Time magazine almost a decade ago that, Harvard Law Review defined privacy like in 55 or something like that, somewhere in the 19th century, as the right to be left alone. And that's kind of been the cornerstone of privacy rights throughout, American history and American jurisprudential history. And the reason why I found that such a profound definition is because the Quran 1400 years ago defines privacy as the exact same way, that the right to be left alone, and that you cannot you cannot interfere in someone's privacy or personal space or property without first gaining affirmative consent and permission. And short of affirmative, knowledgeable consent and permission, that's not permitted. What we're seeing with big tech now is a ton of loopholes that get around it. Algorithms that can drive behavior, that can manipulate emotions, that can convince people to buy stuff, to have sorrow, to feel anger, to feel joy. And in some ways, that feels like a violation of privacy rights. And so how do we tackle that in a way that recognizes that we live in the secular world? And I think you and I, one thing we vehemently agree on is this critical need for secular government, for a separation of religion and state, while also recognizing that with that comes kind of this mushy definition of what morality is. And oftentimes morality in this space is defined by whoever's in power, and might makes right. How do you reconcile that as a humanist chaplain?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, Qasim, and what I would say is it's really underscored by the fact that what many of the tech barons, titans, demigods, whatever, are telling us they're trying to do is, quote, building God, unquote. And you have that even there just this week. There was a story in Vox, a headline: AI companies are trying to build God. Shouldn't they get our permission first? Wow. The public did not consent to artificial general intelligence. That's Sigal Samuel writing for Vox. There's another headline that I loved recently. There's a book out called AI Snake Oil by two leading Princeton professors, Sayash Kapoor and Arvind Narayanan, leading AI scholars who talk about what AI is and what AI isn't. But one of their articles promoting their book was AI companies are pivoting from building gods to creating products good. And it's, maybe that's a slightly more conservative framing of it than what the first headline I just read to you was. But, if this is the biggest industry in the world today, as we're told that it is, and even the Nobel Prizes this week seem to confirm giving multiple Nobel Prizes to people who aren't even physicists or chemists in those fields for AI, it says something that they actually have to pivot from building a god,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, the idea is, in in thoughtful religious communities and discourses, right? People of deep consideration and deep ethical formation decide together how we go forward as a society, what is right, what is decent, what is moral, what is compassion.
Yeah.
In humanism, in the best of the humanist traditions that I come from, and we all know that there are plenty of people in the world who mess up humanism and mess up religion. So none of our traditions, neither yours nor mine, are in any way perfect, but we do our best, right? In humanism, it's people, through deep consideration, reasoning through, thinking through, uh, with heart, with love, what is the best way for human beings to live and move forward. But with AI, you've got these trillion-dollar companies where a very, very few people, almost all of whom are men, almost most of whom are white men, most of whom are now billionaires,
Yeah.
are deciding for us and creating algorithms that not only decide for us, but decide for them.
Sure.
What to do, how to do it, what humanity needs. And we're being told, literally and figuratively, that if your cheese is sliding off your pizza, you should glue it on. Right? I mean, that's something that Google Gemini actually literally said to people, in recent months, right? And the democratic equivalent thereof. Hey, Gemini, the cheese of my democracy is sliding off the sauce of my civic engagement and my popular education, my democratic education. What should I do? And Gemini says, well, if your cheese and your sauce are sliding off of one another, just glue them together. Maybe use crazy glue. How about that?
Yeah. The you bring up an interesting point about how every tradition has its people that we're not terribly proud of. I I would make one nuance where I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. People of faith, I think, would argue, by and large, and you can't ever make blanket statements because it's just not wise. But I think people of faith would argue that it's not the faith or the teaching that's problematic; it's the people, right? Or the people engaging in behavior that isn't great. And you know, um, we can make arguments for that as well. But I think where to me the conversation about the humanistic approach to tech agnostic, or in your book, is really exciting, is really kind of watching that journey, because regardless of the tradition, you're always going to have people who manipulate, or I mean, humanism can teach about the critical need of empathy and humanity and sympathy and compassion. You're still going to have humanists who are like, I'm going to interpret it a different way and behave a different way. Islam will teach about service to humanity as the primary focus, and you're going to have people who will say, I'm going to interpret it a different way. But I think what's unique here, and I think this is the distinction between the humanist approach to this and I think the religious approach to this, is the religious approach to this will argue that we have a standard kind of moral guide, and the humanist approach will argue we have a current moral guide, but that may change based on circumstances going forward. And I think that's where it's really kind of interesting and also frightening to me, because you have, and I think you mentioned this to me offline, so if I'm misquoting you, correct me, but you mentioned how so many of the people in this tech space identify as non-religious of any
Yes.
capacity.
Yes.
And that is fascinating, because the end result, whether it's somebody enabling the Rohingya genocide, or whether it's somebody who is ostensibly a believer and bombing Palestinian civilians, the end result is the exact same. And I think the overarching argument you make in your book becomes that much more powerful, that at the end of the day, despite where we come from in our backgrounds, it is critical that we collaborate as believers and non-believers and work on a meaningful solution to this, because at the end of the day, if we're sitting here arguing about what's the right religion while bombs are dropping, those bombs are
Yeah.
not going to discriminate, and it's critical we need to work together.
Yeah, it's so true. I so appreciate you and your perspective there. And so, in response to that, I'll start with, I'll actually start with an area of slight disagreement between us, perhaps, and then I'll move to an area of huge agreement that's much more consequential. So, you were talking about, is it the teaching versus is it the people, right? When religion goes awry or humanism goes awry, as they both, sometimes do. And, that might be an interesting theological discussion or debate that could be had between somebody like myself as a humanist and, a religious person like yourself, right? Like, okay, some would say that the teachings, in their own way are perfect, but the people mess them up. I would probably be more inclined to say that it's a mix, that sometimes the teachings are great and people misinterpret them or mess them up. And sometimes things that get codified as sacred teachings from my humanist perspective shouldn't really be codified as such, at all. They're actually just human made in my belief, and we should be more willing to let them go. But regardless, the thing about that is it doesn't necessarily play that much of a role, I wonder, in what we actually do, our actual behavior, right? Like, whether you think that the teaching is the issue versus the people is the issue, I think people tend to mess up and do good, be selfish and be loving at similar-ish levels. It'd be hard to do a formal study of it right now. But the thing is, as you say, many of the tech leaders who are causing us the biggest problems with their grandiosity, with their selfishness and greed, with their recklessness and, their messianism, are in fact secular. They're atheists, they're humanists. They ought to be in the literal or metaphorical pews of my congregation. And I'm trying, they say, come get your people. A lot of this book that I've just written, Tech Agnostic, is me trying to do my best efforts, and get others like me to do their best efforts to come get our people, because our people are messing up. They are assuming that they don't need to check themselves.
Sure.
They're going out and they're perfectly willing to wreck themselves and all of us.
Yeah, no, I think that your framing of whether it's the teaching or whether as a humanist you can say, well, maybe it's not the teaching, it's just the people. I think it's a good framing, and I agree with that. And I think that goes back to why, at the end of the day, it's critical that we collaborate and work together. Greg, we're down to our last couple of minutes. I'd love for you to share with our listeners how they can pick up your book, how they can partner with you, and whether they're a believer or a non-believer, how they can reach out to you. And I will say this, as somebody who is an observant Muslim, you absolutely need to connect with Greg. He's a wonderful human being. He is the humanist version of Jason Statham. Looks like him too a little bit. And he's just a great person that you want to be around. So how can folks connect with you? How can they get involved with your work?
Oh, that's so kind of you. And especially when I set you up, I teed you up, like you could have mocked me mercilessly for the check yourself, wreck yourself thing. And that just shows your extraordinary generosity that you did no such thing. So yes, Greg Epstein is my name. The book is Tech Agnostic: How Technology Became the World's Most Powerful Religion. It's available for pre-order as I speak this. Anywhere you want. It's okay if you want to buy it on Amazon. I absolve you. It's not going to make that much of a difference this way or that way. I would be honored if you'd pick it up. You can find me these days. I'm struggling with social media, but definitely find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter, RIP. And it's such an honor to talk to you, Qasim, and maybe I'll do something with you on social media, because when I interact with you and the few people that are out there that I can say are like you, because you're a pretty rare guy, I feel a little bit better and a little bit less icky about being on social media.
Well, hey, that's my you took the words out of my mouth. I think we need to drive the narrative and show that this can be used for good. It can be used to bring folks together and to better and improve our humanity, regardless of faith or no faith. And I'm grateful to be in that fight with you, brother.
Thank you so much. You too. I'll be following your work really closely, and delighted to connect with your audience. And let's make the Reformation happen together.
Amen, brother. If I could say that in a particular way. Greg Epstein, a humanist chaplain at Harvard and at MIT. Pick up his new book, Tech Agnostic. I got it. And if you have a local independent library, order from them. But however you can, get your hands on it. Phenomenal read. Really puts into perspective what's happening with the tech world and why certain decisions are being made the way they are, and how do we address this in a meaningful way that improves our mental health, our social health, and I'll even say our spiritual health. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View, channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View, channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. That was Greg Epstein. Just the guy is just a salt of the earth. A phenomenal human being, thoughtful, compassionate, hilarious. I had a chance to grab dinner with him a few weeks ago, and I'm glad that he was able to come on our show today and speak to you. Highly recommend you pick up his book, Tech Agnostic, sold wherever books are sold. And highly encourage you to get it from your local independent bookshop. Let's support independent bookshops, but do whatever's convenient for you. I want to close with revisiting where we started this conversation about Gaza, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, because the question I have to ask now is, what happened to getting a deal done? It took until spring of 2024 to convince Biden to start to aggressively call for a ceasefire. And by May and June, there were ceasefire deals on the table that Hamas accepted. And then Israel went back on those. And then even after Biden withdrew from the 2024 election, VP Harris launched her campaign by saying that we are going to get a deal done now. But now we've seen a massive shift in that. Reuters reports that the Biden administration believes it is appropriate for Israel to continue with its attacks on Lebanon. And Voice of America reported on October 10th that U.S. support for Israel's campaign in Lebanon is a departure from the ceasefire made in late September. And that when Biden spoke with Netanyahu last week, he didn't even bring up ceasefire, didn't even mention it. And this is particularly shocking because journalist Bob Woodward reports that President Biden knows Netanyahu has been lying to him all this time. And he quotes Biden as saying, that SOB, Bibi Netanyahu, he's a bad guy, he's a bad effing guy. And so the questions that I want legacy media to ask that they're not asking is, what does it say about Biden's judgment if he knows that Netanyahu is a bad effing guy, but continues to arm him anyway? What message does it send to the 77% of Democrats and 61% of Republicans who demand cessation of arms from Netanyahu, that while Biden agrees with them that Netanyahu is untrustworthy, he continues to arm him anyway? And why is Biden taking a position completely contrary to his promise to get a deal done while ignoring the genocide in Palestine and ignoring the hostages languishing in prison? In just 2 weeks, Netanyahu has killed more than 2,000 civilians in Lebanon, injured more than 10,000. He's killed more than 100 healthcare workers. He's displaced more than 1.2 million Lebanese citizens. That's a quarter of the population. That'd be like displacing 80 million Americans. His army is shooting and killing unarmed civilians fleeing northern Gaza. And he's injured multiple UN peacekeepers, and he's arrested American journalist Jeremy Lafredo for reporting from Israel. This is not working. If Iraq and Afghanistan have taught us anything, it's that war creates more war. And this whole escalation strategy and now tangling with Iran is not going to help our country at all. It risks global war. It really does. And we need to be serious about that. And it risks losing any semblance of democracy that we had left here in the United States. If you have influence on Biden, we need him to uphold the Leahy law, stop arming Netanyahu, and do what Americans, Israelis, and Palestinians and Lebanese want and end the siege now. In the meantime, hostages continue to suffer, children continue to be killed, and the war lobby continues to profit. None of that bodes well for global peace, and none of that bodes well for sustaining American democracy this November. All right, my friends, thanks for letting me vent. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate your support. If you're listening on Substack, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you're listening on SiriusXM, thank you for listening. Be sure to share this. Thank you for your compassion, your advocacy. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on SiriusXM Review. We'll be right back next week with another phenomenal show. Peace.
This is the Karen Hunter Show. We're talking powers and becomes action.
Let's stop doing black, ADOS, I'm from this, I'm from that, you're African, I'm Haitian. I don't care. They didn't ask Mike Brown what language he spoke when they killed that 18-year-old, Amadou Diallo from Africa, and George Floyd. They didn't care where he came from when Derek Chauvin and those 3 other police officers deprived him of his life. He's black, and the world saw that. Let's keep it simple.
The Karen Hunter Show, SiriusXM's Urban View.